Okay, guys, so this is the APUSH note set for Thursday, the 19th of March. We are still working on our Cold War and culture notes that we've been working on the last two of these videos, if you're kind of trying to keep up that way. And just as a reminder, where we were last time, talk basically about the beginnings of the Cold War, how U.S. foreign policy changed, especially kind of around the bipolarization of Europe, the Berlin airlift, and then the Chinese Revolution. And then we also talked a little bit, or we started in on this section here, on kind of what I would consider like the domestic side of the Cold War. The Cold War's like home front, right, under Truman, looking especially in focus at the Second Red Scare. If you're trying to sort of sum up the Second Red Scare, things that you would want to have included in there: Truman's loyalty program, congressional investigations around spies, including HUAC, McCarthyism, and then also the kind of conservative backlash that includes the Taft-Hartley Act. So those were those kind of the terms that you should maybe associate with the Second Red Scare itself, and that's kind of where we left off in the previous video. So we're kind of continuing today to talk a little bit more about like the domestic 1950s, at least at the beginning of this particular note set. And one of the things that's going on that's kind of Cold War home fronty that impacts the 1950s domestic scene quite a bit has to do with government spending. The 50s is a period where the US government is putting a lot of money into the economy, mostly by spending on kind of military Cold War type stuff. So by ramping up the size of our military, by paying for new kind of um, what am I looking for? Armaments, tanks, weapons, planes, those kinds of things. If you remember when we talked about the 1930s, we used the phrase pump primer to talk about the idea that the government kind of pumping money into the economy creates like a stimulus, right? And keeps the economy flowing, keeps money flowing through the economy. And so kind of Cold War spending is going to really serve that role here. It is in the 1950s that our government, I would say, kind of doubles down on the economic theory of the New Deal. If you think about it, the stuff that we did during the New Deal, that was during a time of crisis, right? We had a depression, we had a war, and in the 50s, we could have like theoretically rolled all of that back and just gone back to being laissez-faire, no government involvement, etc. But under Truman, we don't. We basically commit to this sort of New Deal-esque idea of Keynesian pump priming type spending. And a big place where we see that outside of what I was just talking about in terms of like military contracts and things of that nature is in something called the GI Bill. So this is GI Bill as in the GI law, and what GI stands for, it's a nickname for American military troops, Army especially, during World War II. So GI Bill is like saying soldier's law or something of that nature. And what the GI Bill, the original one, did was it offered veterans, so if you had fought in World War II or if you were a veteran in some way, you could get money, essentially, there, or access to money that you could use in one of three ways. You could use your GI Bill money to go to college. It would pay for tuition and like associated college costs. You could use your GI Bill money to get a low cost home loan, so to buy a home, mortgage, right, etc., to get access to that. Or you could use your GI Bill money benefits to get a low interest business loan. So college, home, business. And the important thing about those three options is whatever you use, whichever one of those you sort of choose to do, all three of those are middle class signifiers, right? Being a homeowner or being a business owner or being a college graduate, those are all things that kind of move you into the middle class if you're not there already. And so what the GI Bill does in large part is it basically creates the modern day sense of America as a middle class country. It's going to move whole kind of generations of men out of like poverty and like the working class and into the some lower middle class in some cases, but definitely the middle class, solidly in other cases. If you think about the United States today and you think about our sort of demographic curve, right? This idea that we have a very small kind of wealthy population at the top, and then most of the country is sort of middle class in some way, upper, lower, right, middle class, and then you have a population of people who live in poverty that's smaller than the middle class. That curve with the middle class being the dominant section, that is created several other government programs, but especially by the GI Bill here in the 1940s. It's quite a big deal. So lots of these GIs, they're coming home, they are getting married, they're using their GI Bill, to buy a house or to go to college or whatnot. And the other thing that a lot of them are doing in this time period is they're having babies. The 15 years after World War II, so that's 1945 to 1960. Those 15 years are usually referred to as the baby boom. And people who were born in those 15 years from 1945 to 1960, excuse me, are the generation who are referred to as boomers, baby boomers, right? So if you look at this, like the graph here of the American birth rate, you can see this little dip right here. That's the pardon me, the war. So men away, not a lot of babies being born. The birth rate dips, pardon me. And then this big spike up, that's like the initial baby boom. And then the kind of continued curve right up here that sort of peaks in 1960. You can kind of see that right there. That curve right there, that's the baby boom. These baby boomers are going to be, there's so many of them, like it's such a big increase in US birth rate that they're going to become the dominant like population group that is going to dominate American culture for really the rest of the 20th century. In the 1950s, when baby boomers are all little kids, we have a very like family kind of kid focused society. In the 1960s and 70s, when baby boomers become teenagers and kind of move into college, we get a very like youth counterculture focused kind of society. In the 80s, baby boomers really enter like the workplace in large numbers, and we get kind of more of a yuppie type focused society, right, et cetera, et cetera. So they're like the dominant generation for the rest of the 20th century. We'll almost be kind of like following the baby boomers as we talk about like changes in social culture and things of that nature. So having, a new baby or two and a new wife and, money to go to college or money to go buy a home. Another thing that is a kind of cultural shift or impact of this what's going on here in the post World War II years is the creation of the suburbs and suburban culture. Before World War II, mostly people live in a city, an urban area, or they live in a rural area. They live in the country, and there's not really like an in-between kind of sense. Suburbs are going to be that in-between. A suburb is suburban, right? It's like outside of the city. And the idea of a suburb, if you think about it, is that you can kind of live outside of the city, but you're close enough to commute in to work in the city. So you live in the suburbs, and you work in, downtown, as an advertising executive or whatever the case might be. So in order to have suburbs, you have to have cars, like most people have to have cars, and you have to have some sort of road infrastructure in cities in place that can take you like into and out of the city pretty easily. And so the first time that that's really a thing that's possible is here in the 1950s. Other things that make the suburbs like a thing in the 1950s. Remember that during the 30s, we talked about the creation of the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, to try to encourage and like support home ownership and the GI Bill mortgages and all those things. There's a lot more people are now within reach of this idea of owning their own home, not just like an apartment or, tenement apartment or renting, but actually owning a home. The only suburb kind of term that you really need to know is Levittown. Levittown is the first mass-produced suburb in the United States, built in 1947-48 outside of New York City. The guy who builds it is, I think his first name is Arthur, but it's like Mr. Levitt, basically. And he's going to build a whole bunch of these Levittowns all over the country. Again, the first one's in New York, but there's I think a dozen at least Levittowns all over the country. And they're going to become kind of the first mass-produced suburb. They are affordable. You could buy a house for under $8,000, which would be the equivalent of about $80,000 today. So not no money, but within reach. You could save up $80,000. A lot cheaper than modern housing. You cannot buy a house for $80,000 today, right? So that's kind of the Levittown plan. This is a picture of the street in the first Levittown. I think this is the one in New York. You can see how. Like, I find this picture very creepy because you can see how like the pitch of the roof here is like they're all the same angle, right? It's a kind of Valley of the Dolls. So the suburbs are going to develop, they're going to come to kind of symbolize, I think is maybe more what I want to say, the conformity of the 1950s, is something that we'll talk about more in a future note set. But they're very associated with like 50s culture of conformity. A really important thing to understand about the suburbs in the 1950s in particular is that like the ability to live in suburbs was very limited by race. Every single suburb that I know of that was constructed in the 1950s had included in their sort of paperwork or contracts something called a racial covenant. And what a racial covenant was like a part of the contract that essentially said only white people can buy this house. So Levittown had racial covenants. You could only buy a house from a Levittown dealer if you were white. And when you bought a house, the contract that you signed said that you could only sell it to white people as well. So effectively locking out, it's like primarily aimed at Black families, but really anybody who's not white or white passing would be locked out of home ownership in the suburbs. You may remember in the 1930s when we were talking about the New Deal, we talked briefly about something called redlining. Remember that organization, the FHA, that's issuing home loans, that it created these maps that labeled like areas of the city and said that if you live in this area that's maybe say heavily Black or heavily Hispanic or just heavily like impoverished, well then these people they can't get home loans, or they're not eligible for these types of home loans. So between racial covenants and then redlining, if you were an African American family, say the father in the family had fought in World War II and he was a veteran and he has this GI Bill money and he wants to buy his family a nice home out in the suburbs, he almost certainly couldn't, right? He would be sort of locked out of that experience. So this period from, say, end of World War II until 1968, which is when redlining is outlawed, that sort of 25-ish year period, is a period where lots of white families establish generational wealth, right? They buy a home in the suburbs. That home starts out at $8,000, say in 1950. Today, you would buy that house for maybe $450,000. So that home's going to appreciate a lot in value. And the Black families who theoretically sort of were at the same level, they also fought in the war, they also have this GI Bill money, but they can't have access to that home ownership experience because they can't get a loan because of where they live, or they can't buy a house in the suburb because of their skin color, right? Those types of things. If you're kind of interested in redlining or in kind of the impacts of housing policy in this period, there's two really interesting links that are on here that I strongly suggest. This is a quick, like about a 6.5-minute video from NPR's Code Switch podcast on what redlining is and then how it impacts communities. It does start with a Chris Rock joke, so there's a F-bomb basically in the first minute. I wouldn't listen to that in a room with young siblings, but otherwise that's a great video. The other thing, this NPR interview down here, you can read or listen to this. This is really good on basically the FHA and like racial covenants and federal lending policies. So those are, if you're interested in this topic at all, those are good continuation reads. So what you might be, I think, correctly getting the sense of is that the late 1940s here, we're still very, very heavily segregated, but we're also kind of starting to see some stirs or activism around civil rights. You may remember me mentioning that during the war, that there was the first kind of federal government like anti-discrimination organization was created, the FEPC, but then it was dissolved. If you're looking at federal government action in support of civil rights, Truman's desegregation of the military here in 1948 is a pretty big deal. Truman is really the first president to take any permanent action on this, right? FDR's stuff was a little bit more temporary and everybody else has just kind of like not dealt with it. So Truman's action in 1948 to desegregate the military, which is a small step in many ways, but the military is a big institution. That's a lot of people. It is a good, I think, a sign that we're starting to see some shifts in maybe government opinion or some success from the many decades of activism in the Black community that we've seen through like the NAACP, et cetera. The other thing that's going on in 1948 is that there is an election going on. Truman had not been elected in 44. He became president because FDR died, right? And just a few months after his election in 44. And so this is 1948 is Truman's sort of first election, and he's going to push for some very, very, very minor civil rights goals, the integration of the military, a few other little things as well. And what we see as a result of that is sort of some fracturing within the Democratic Party. The 1948 election is kind of an interesting one, considering it features a lot of people that you might not be familiar with. Republicans are going to go with a guy named Thomas Dewey, who you don't need to know much about, except that he's, I would say, a relatively conservative Republican. Current President Truman, right here, is mixed popular. He won the war, sort of, but also the Democrats weren't super happy with him. So he has kind of two challengers from within his party. One of them is this guy here, Henry Wallace. Wallace had been FDR's original vice president. Well, he was vice president for 2 terms with FDR. He had gotten booted from the vice presidency in favor of Truman because the rest of the party thought that Wallace was too progressive, too left-wing, right, in the Democratic Party. And so he's going to run as a third-party candidate on the Progressive Party. He's a fairly popular candidate. Maybe more troubling in terms of like peeling people off the Democratic Party. The white South is really not happy with Truman's sort of like mini desegregation type stuff that he's doing. And so there's a guy named Strom Thurmond, who is a long-term senator from the South, alive forever, and he's going to run on a party that's officially called the States' Rights Democratic Party, but it's usually just known as the Dixiecrats, and that's just a pro-segregation party, as I think you can probably kind of guess from the name. Going into the 1948 election, every single poll predicts that this is going to be a Dewey victory. They're like, Dewey's going to win, President Truman's going to lose, etc. And as the results roll in, it looks like that's going to be the case. But then a few West Coast states kind of like pull it out for Truman, and he's going to wind up defeating Dewey in a surprise victory. This is This is Truman right here, and this is the happiest you will ever see him in a photograph. And he's holding the Chicago paper had gone to print too early and ran with the Dewey defeats Truman headline, which was actually not correct. So that's Truman being like, ha ha. Here's the 1948 electoral map. You can kind of see what I mean about if you look at the blue for Truman being like a lot stronger over here on the West Coast, right? You can see that a little bit. The other thing that's notable about this is these kind of mustard yellow states down here. These are the states that voted for Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats. And this is the first time that any of these states, certainly Mississippi and Alabama, have voted for anybody but a Democrat since Reconstruction ended. So we see the cracks in this idea of the South as this kind of solidly like committed to the Democratic Party. And why? Civil rights, right? That's what's kind of causing these cracks. It's not permanent yet, as we'll see. Oops, pardon me. It's not permanent yet, as we will see. But it is, we can see some signs of the kind of coalition of the Democratic Party is weakening. So there's a lot on this slide that you don't necessarily need to know detail about, but what you should know is that Truman's like 1948 and then into 1949, his sort of domestic policies are often referred to as the fair deal. So Teddy Roosevelt had the square deal. FDR had the New Deal. Truman proposes what he calls the fair deal, right, as his sort of domestic policies for the country. Basically an extension of a lot of New Deal stuff, like keeping welfare programs going, Social Security expanding, those kinds of things. But remember that Truman does not have much of a mandate, right? If we go back to this, you'll see his numbers are very small. It's not like, oh, everybody voted for Truman, so let's listen to him. So a lot of the stuff that Truman proposes in the fair deal doesn't wind up happening. And it's for this reason that a lot of the stuff that Europe is doing in this time period, like say, for example, passing health insurance, government-run like healthcare, Britain in this time period is passing the NHS, their National Healthcare Service. That's kind of coming into creation in this time period. The reason why that doesn't happen here in the United States is because of kind of this election and this time period. So Truman has like proposed these policies, but he's a pretty weak president. The civil rights agenda is kind of controversial, and so it's going to cause a lot of this stuff to be like downvoted in the United States. So that's the kind of Truman's fair deal in a nutshell. Your textbook goes into this in like a lot more detail if you're like question mark on. Last thing, kind of chunk of stuff for today. Back to kind of the foreign affairs side of the Truman presidency. A reminder that when we last talked about this in yesterday's notes, China had fallen to communism, and Truman had kind of felt like he was being tagged as like weak on communism or that sort of at fault for China falling. And so that's why in 1950, when the situation in Korea starts, the United States is going to take such an aggressive role. Situation in Korea. Korea is a peninsula that had been occupied or had been part of Japanese territory since about 1910. So when the World War II is over, the United States military occupies kind of the southern part of Korea, and the northern part of Korea is going to wind up occupied essentially by Soviet troops who sort of sweep down through China in the last few days of the war and then kind of take up position in northern Korea. So we wind up with a situation that's very similar to what we saw in Germany, where we have North Korea, Soviet occupied, that's going to create, pardon me, a communist state. And South Korea, that's United States occupied, that's going to create a democratic state, or at least a non-communist state anyway, that's supported by the United States. Keep in mind, in Europe, when we talk about communist, non-communist, it's an east-west divide, right? East, non-communist, west, pardon me, east, communist, west, non-communist. In Asia, though, both in Korea and in Vietnam, when we get to Vietnam, it's a north-south divide. So north, communist, south, non-communist. That's just a good thing to keep in mind. By 1950, the kind of government that the United States had set up in South Korea, we've decided that it's capable of essentially surviving on its own. So we've withdrawn a lot of our troops that had been stationed there. And once we withdraw our troops that have been stationed there, the North Korean government is going to push an invasion into the country. So in June of 1950, the North Korean government, the capital of North Korea is right up here, Pyongyang. They're going to push from Pyongyang down to the border between the two countries, which is the 38th parallel, basically. They're going to push down to that border, and they're going to try to take the South Korean capital of Seoul, which is very close to the border between the two countries and is going to change hands a bunch during what's going to become the Korean War. Once North Korea has invaded South Korea, the United States is going to take this to the newly formed United Nations. Keep in mind the United Nations is really young. It's only like 3 years old at this point as far as an entity. And so what the US is going to say is, hey, United Nations, remember when we said that countries shouldn't invade each other, they should respect each other's borders? Well, this is bad, and we should stop North Korea from invading South Korea. The United Nations will vote. The Soviet Union could have vetoed this, but they're not there. They're boycotting the United Nations. And remember that the China seat is still held by the Taiwanese government, basically by nationalist China. So they're going to vote to come in support of South Korea. And what we're basically going to see over the next 6 months to a year is the Korean War is not it's not a U.S. war. The Korean War is not technically the United States military. What it is it's the United Nations made up of a lot of U.S. soldiers fighting on the side of South Korea and against North Korea. So this is, if you have ever read or seen that the Korean War is not really a declared war on the part of the United States, that's true, right? The U.S. government never declares war on Korea. We never have. But what we are is we're part of this United Nations peacekeeping force. It's an army that's there to support the sovereignty of South Korea. I think that's the best way to say that. So if you think about the Korean War, it's kind of like this like teeter-totter type thing. If you look at the maps, you can see this pretty clearly. But so we have North Korea invade South Korea pretty successfully, and they're going to kind of push South Korean government all the way down in flight. They take over Seoul, etc. And then in September of 1950, the UN forces arrive. It's mostly Americans at first, and we're going to land at Busan, and we're going to push up, sort of retake Seoul, and then instead of stopping at the 38th parallel, having successfully pushed the North Koreans out of South Korea, what we're going to do instead is we're going to keep invading North Korea. Once we cross that 38th parallel and we invade North Korea, then China is going to come in on North Korea's side, and they're going to kind of push back down. So you have like North Korean invasion, UN forces, China comes in, and we wind up kind of balanced out right around the middle of the country. So by the time that we hit like the winter of 1950 into 1951, the war has sort of settled into this stalemate. You can kind of picture both sides pulling on a tug of rope and kind of having equal strength. That's the sort of where we're at as of 1951. The general in charge of the United Nations troops is an American military general named Douglas MacArthur, who had been a World War II general as well, and was I would say, very like popular with his men, kind of a rough and tumble, like, kill them all, let God sort them out type of like old school army guy. And so he was pretty popular with his men, but I would say kind of controversial. And he really does not like or respect Truman very much as commander in chief. I think he's like, Truman's kind of this short little dude with glasses who doesn't know anything about the military. And so MacArthur both is the one who makes the call to push across the 38th parallel, which he probably shouldn't have done without authorization. And he talks very repeatedly and publicly about the fact that he thinks that he should be using nuclear weapons in North Korea and potentially against China as well. Truman does not want to do that. He tells MacArthur, like, shut up, basically, and MacArthur doesn't. And so by April of 51, Truman is going to relieve MacArthur of command. This is probably the correct decision, but a very unpopular decision. MacArthur retains, I would say, a pretty good chunk of his kind of popularity with the country, and whatever like level of authority that Truman had over the conflict or to negotiate some sort of peace, that sort of goes when MacArthur goes as well. So the Korean War is kind of hanging out in a stalemate. We're really not moving much in either direction. Into all of this, into the middle of the Red Scare and the Korean War, comes the 1952 election. In 1952, the Democrats had been in charge of the country for a long time. We took control. FDR's first election, he became president in 1933, and there has been a Democrat in charge, like, as president ever since. So that's like, a long time, 20 years at this point. That's a very long time for one party to hang on to the presidency. The Republicans, either by luck or by savvy, are going to nominate a very good, strong candidate for kind of their base in 1952, and that is former U.S. General Dwight Eisenhower, who had been kind of the top commanding American general in Europe. Eisenhower is one of the line of kind of American military presidents. He doesn't have like political experience before this. So he's like a George Washington or Andrew Jackson or Ulysses S. Grant, right? He sort of fits in that like line of presidents. And he's going to kind of balance himself out by picking a younger, more politically connected guy from the West, this Richard Nixon, who is a congressman from California at the time. He was quite young. He's going to be Eisenhower's vice president for 2 terms here in the 1950s. And you'll see him again, as I think we know. So here's our 1952 electoral map. This is a pretty big victory for Eisenhower and the Republican Party, partially just because Eisenhower himself is so popular, and partially just because the 50s are going to be a little more conservative. Again, there's a sense that the Democrats have been in charge for a long time, maybe some fumbles on the part of the Truman administration. Eisenhower also very sort of savvily doesn't really like come in any direction on civil rights. He has no sort of platform or position on it, and it's going to kind of allow that issue to like settle a little bit politically. You'll notice that the Democratic Party kind of returns to the solid South. So talking about those cracks, we're going to see that increase as the civil rights movement really starts to push forward. So it's kind of 1952 election. So the last segment of these notes looks at Eisenhower's foreign policy, specifically at his usage of the CIA, and also a little bit of his domestic stuff, talk a bit about the space race and Sputnik and things like that. And that's the last segment of these notes that we will pick up on the Monday that we begin e-learning, which is March 30th, I believe. So the next time that I will see you guys for notes will be after our spring break week, Monday, March 30th. These videos will stay up for you to watch at any time. As always, thank you for your time, and feel free to email me with any questions that you might have. And again, I will see you guys on March 30th. Have a great one.